Okay, so we're going to go over the section about reptiles, and I want you guys to be thinking about what we've mentioned regarding amphibians and see if you can, as we go through this, think about those things that make them different and similar. Because remember, I think I might have mentioned that they used to kind of group them all together, but you can definitely see some major differences, but some similarities as well. So, when we talk about reptiles, one thing that we need to know is that many of them have already become extinct, which is pretty sad. But there are still, quite a few in the world, obviously, and we're familiar with a lot of them in our own environment here in Wisconsin. So they have thick skin, they're cold-blooded, they're ectothermic. So we've mentioned that related to amphibians, so that should sound familiar to us. And it's usually with their skin kind of dry and rough. They have what's called an amniotic egg, and we're going to talk about that. So when we talked about amphibians, remember they were soft, laid in water. The reptile egg tends to be a little more tough because it's laid on land, and you can kind of see the difference here. This is a harder shell and this is more soft, generally speaking, right? So when we break down the amniotic egg, we want to look at a couple of different features. So this is going to look a lot like what you've seen related to like a human embryo, right? So there's the embryo, and there's this allantois, which actually is kind of like the placenta. It stores the waste and gets rid of the waste. There's an amniotic sac here that protects and cushions, and the albumin, which gives water and protein. That's kind of outside here. And then there's this yolk, which provides the nourishment. And of course, the shell around the very outside is very strong for a shell and protects. So there's a lot to the amniotic egg of a reptile. And when we talk about reptiles, we're talking about, animals that lay eggs typically on land or close to water, and it's by internal fertilization. So some examples: turtles, tortoises, crocodiles, alligators, snakes, lizards, tuataras. We're probably familiar with a lot of those, even if they're not native to Wisconsin, from, going to the zoo or maybe being on vacation somewhere. We have snakes, we have lizards, not very many lizards here in Wisconsin naturally, right? And tuataras are kind of unique. We'll talk about them too. So what's the difference between a turtle and a tortoise? That typically comes up. So for those of you who've maybe, at least seen videos of sea turtles, they're swimmers, right? And their shell is kind of streamlined to be able to swim and turn rapidly. And so they look a little bit different as far as the shell than a tortoise. A tortoise is typically on land, and it's more rounded and kind of dry. So you can kind of see the difference there. Now remember, there's exceptions because a lot of the reptiles live on land, but then you have a sea turtle that's in water. So there's always exceptions. We just kind of talk generally about them. Then we have crocodiles and alligators, and I have a hard time if they're not side by side seeing the difference between them. It's hard when you don't see them together. So the crocodile on the left is an American crocodile. The head is narrow and pointed snout, right? And then the alligator on the right, the American alligator, has kind of a broad head and a rounded snout. So they're kind of tricky to tell the difference, I think, if you can't see that closely. And then I mentioned the tuatara. It reminds you of a lizard, right? And they're kind of interesting because they have really not changed in 150 million years. So they did it right the first time, so to speak, as far as their characteristics, and they've survived. So there's a picture of one just to kind of show us that. But we also have snakes in this group. And of course, there's lots of different kinds of snakes. But this is just a basic overview of the main ones.